Welcome to another episode of Rice and One Potatoes. Today we're going to be doing a book review of I Am Not a Tourist by Daisy Hun. And joining me today is Eli. So welcome back, Eli.
Hello.
It's really interesting because when Eli was on the podcast last time, she mentioned about this book. And off the back of that, I went out and bought the book. And after that, we said, well, it's actually a really interesting read. So we should try to record our thoughts and what we think. And so not really a review, more like sharing our thoughts after
Having a chat about it, yeah. As we maybe have talked about before, there's quite a lot of discourse around being Asian American and American Chinese. But I find that often, or I've not really found anyone writing that extensively about the experience of being British Chinese specifically. Having read it now, I can tell you that she had quite a complicated move to get to actually the UK. So was born in Hong Kong, raised in Canada, and then moved to the States, met her husband and got married in the States and had 2 daughters. And then they moved together to Oxford. So slightly different experiences. But she takes you on this tour through history of the connections between Britain and China historically. She writes a lot about like restaurant owners because that's a very big part of what it means to be British Chinese. But also stories from longer ago, stories from more recently.
Daisy refers to the reasons why she wrote the book. She says, this book is for my daughters, so they can see themselves reflected in this country, to help them understand British Chinese histories that aren't taught in national curricula or readily available in mainstream media, and to hear about others living similar lives to theirs. And really, that is the essence of what we're trying to do here, of this platform, to try to share some stories. That to me was really powerful. And then the other piece is about, I consistently found that East and Southeast Asian voices were inadequately represented in conversations about racism. The assumptions was they were doing just fine. But then that wasn't the only reason why she sort of wrote the book. It's for others to know that we exist, to leave a legacy, to know that we are not alone.
I think those quotes really summarize my main reflections from the book. So the first one being, she really talks about the history of being British Chinese in a way that I had never really known or even had the opportunity to even know where to look. One of the recurring themes in the book is this idea of being a model minority, or a group of people who maybe historically haven't stood up for themselves in the same way as other groups, and have been more content to sort of sit on the sidelines and just pretend that everything's okay, because that will mean that it's a bit easier.
Should we take the first of the 2 topics?
Yeah, so the history, I guess we'll start with.
Let's start with history. When I got to this section of the book, I went, yes. Finally, someone is talking about this. So the Opium Wars was something I actually studied in China. And I came over when I was like not even 10, so at an earlier age, because in Chinese schooling, this is something which is looked on very proudly. It's like the Falklands War, as you would study it here, or the World Wars, as you would study here. There was an aggressor. We had to defend our homeland. We protected ourselves. We fought back. We won in certain elements. So I knew about sort of the Opium Wars. It happened, the reason why it happened. I saw the Chinese side. And then sort of over time, I don't remember when this was, but I realized, like, look, I never studied this. It was sort of just glossed over in history curricula up to GCSE. I didn't do A-level history. But one thing I didn't know, which this book really brought to my attention, was, well, why was the reason behind the Opium Wars? And it was because essentially the tea that we drink, the tea that you're drinking, initially came from China. And in the 18th century, there was a huge trade deficit between Britain and China. And so China held a lot of the power in that trade. So to make up that difference, they had to find something to export to China. And well, the one thing that came up with was opium. And so it's sort of like really quite concerning that the whole point behind the war is that the Chinese people fought back to say, we don't want your drugs anymore.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about that section of the book where she's really delving into this very like deep and old connection between Britain and China is that later on she's writing about something else and she mentions there was an exhibition that they did on the East India Company, which was essentially the company that was trading the opium or had like deals in India where they were growing opium and producing the drug. And then that was the means by which Britain was then exporting the drug to China. So it wasn't actually direct from Britain to China as such. But so the East Indian Company is essentially responsible for starting the Opium Wars and driving this like terrible period of history. And then Daisy says she had an experience where she went to a sort of exhibition on it, and then there wasn't a single mention of the Opium Wars at all, or the East India's role in it, which I think it just is very telling, because it's not as if the exhibition was, you know, sort of exalting the East India Company or supporting its actions. It obviously wasn't, but it was sort of stunning and shocking to me that what felt like such a big moment in the history of this company wasn't being represented at all in a sort of educational historical setting. And I think that's really one of the strengths of the book, is that she goes into loads of detail and is very well researched in not only the Opium Wars that we've been talking about, but also the sailors that like came and to work here on the boats, and also the soldiers that fought in the World Wars alongside, you know, the soldiers from Britain. And actually there's this interesting fact that she has where they had this sort of memorial scene where it was all the different like parts of the army that had fought, and then they needed space because the Americans had joined and they didn't have space for the Americans, and so they painted over the section of the Chinese soldiers. That really feels like the sort of sense of where British Chinese history lies in the history of Britain, that actually there's such a long, deep connection that we maybe don't think about, because we're like to me, I'm like, actually Chinese people only immigrated to the UK recently. We've had all this recent immigration. It's a very big topic of the students coming from China, lots of people coming here to study, and it feels like there's been a real influx. And I sort of used to look back and be like, when our parents immigrated here in the 90s, that felt kind of early. But then you read the book and you realize, no, Chinese people have been here for hundreds of years. And actually there's such a long, deep history, rich, deep history that just is really being painted over, and just isn't being talked about in any sense.
And then sort of going into World War One, World War Two, one thing that the book taught me that I didn't know about was that how much Chinese people fought in World War One, World War Two, not in Asia, but on the Western Front, in Europe. So there's I think it's in the tens of thousands of people who actually made a journey into UK, into France, into Belgium to actually fight here, both to work in the factories, but also fight on the front lines, to dig up trenches. And then when everyone went home, they were the ones who were left there to fill up the trenches. They were paid. It was a paid army, but it was peanuts that they were paid to really clear up after the war was over. And then that to me is just not at all known about when we did study the world wars.
I think what's interesting is that it feels like it's reflections of things that we've heard about before for other communities, right? So when we think about, so a lot of soldiers came to the UK to fight in the wars, and then after the wars ended, were told to go home. Pack up your bags, you did all this great work, go away. Yeah. Where have we had that before? The whole Windrush scandal, with all the communities that were told they were welcomed here, they came here to work, Britain invited them in, they built lives here, and then a few decades later, the government turns around and says, actually, you never belonged here. You were never British. We don't want you, go home. When actually home has become this country. And I guess it really made me reflect on how grateful we should be to other communities
Yeah, so Daisy talks about this, right? It's when the population became an annoyance, their removal became part of the cleanup effort. Sentiment quickly went from recruitment to repugnance to repatriation to deportation and illegal deportation at that.
Yeah. I think at a time where we're thinking a lot about what it means to be from an ethnic minority in Britain, when we're having all these problems and these troubles with immigration, and that's really, I think, one of the headline issues that the current government is dealing with. Looking back at our histories, it doesn't show us solutions as much as the strength and the fortitude of the people who have lived before us really shines a guiding light in telling me that actually the worries that I'm seeing now as a young person in 2025 aren't necessarily new. Maybe they're specific to our context, but there's a real sense in which I find strength in hearing these stories and seeing that actually we have persevered through, we have had resilience through the difficult times, and we will always end up okay as long as we value community in all of its forms, not only in sort of my British Chinese community and my family community, but also in my other ones. And having strength in that, I think, is something powerful that Daisy reminds us.
And one other thing Daisy talks about in the book is this sense that the British Chinese community is sort of, we are stereotypically sort of self-reliant, and we're seen that way. So she talks about the mono-minority image, which is Chinese people are seen, it's important to seen as academically gifted, hardworking, quiet, law-abiding, and apolitical. While many see this idea as true for them or an accurate reflection of the effort they've made to survive and prove themselves in a white dominant society, this positive betrayal belies its dehumanizing nature, which emphasizes our perceived robotic tendencies towards conformism over individualism, our expected preference for math and science over art and humanities, our lack of social skills and leadership qualities to ascend to the top position across all sectors. And this is perceived by us, by others of us.
I think this pivots us into the second sort of overarching theme in the book, which was this idea of Chinese people as representing a model minority. So some really powerful statistics. You know, she recognizes that Chinese people are more likely to do well in school. Actually, I think in the census data, Chinese kids at GCSE and A-levels were the most likely to achieve the highest grades over any other like diaspora. So over like white kids.
Good job, kids.
Good job. But I think there's a real sense that because as a group we're perceived to succeed in this way, to be able to do well in school, to be able to integrate ourselves into the educational system, the norms of this country. Therefore, there doesn't need to be a conversation about Chinese people struggling or British Chinese people struggling. Because, you've landed your dream job as a lawyer or a doctor. You're doing what, you know, the vision of success is, and therefore your problems don't matter, because how could they matter when you're doing well?
Yeah. You know, another thing that Daisy points out that I became aware of is a hyper-awareness of my differences to my surroundings, how I look, how I sound, how I act, how I'm different. And I think that to me was, as much as anything, I never realized how sensitive I was to all of this. I never knew that I had spider sense tingling all the time. It was as if it was like looking in a mirror and forcing you to look in the mirror to say, this is how others perceive you. Did you know that? I'm like, yeah, I guess I knew it, but subconsciously, but I never consciously challenged myself on it.
Something I've been increasingly thinking about is, actually, am I just feeding into the status quo by wanting to succeed in this way and wanting to sound like I do and wanting to fit into spaces like Oxford, where in a way I think I've only been lucky enough to succeed in the spaces I have because I've worked hard to fit in and to not let how I look, or to compensate for how I look almost. To be like, yeah, I might look like this, but actually I do know what's up and I do know how things work around here. And then now on reading this book, I'm sort of reflecting and I'm actually saying, by doing that, am I just letting sort of them win? Am I just letting go of my Chinese side? Am I sort of devaluing the part of me that feels like it maybe does like maths and science, and maybe I am like more quiet in certain ways, but I think maybe, and this is where we're different, you I think lend into that, and you I think come off as a bit more quiet, a bit more nerdy. You chose to do maths and science at like university, and I think I've done the total opposite, where I've been like, actually I find that the stereotype is so restrictive that even if I was to like similar things to you, or actually be more tend towards being an introvert, I'm not letting myself do that. I have to be outspoken, confident. I have to like literature. I have to, and obviously part of this is still authentic to me, but how much I'm now questioning, how much have I pushed myself towards that in order to distance myself from the narrative that I must be like every other Asian girl.
And I think it's about reclaiming words for us. And Daisy actually quotes Vera, who wrote a chapter titled Yellow in The Good Immigrant. In it, she writes, "I am yellow, I'm small, yellow-skinned female, and 100% ethnically Chinese." She further explains, "I use the word yellow, offensive as many find it, because this is how I believe I'm seen. I use it because, while we can't often tell what someone's race is, we do see colour. I use yellow because I am not black, nor white, nor brown, and I feel I need a little flag to fly."
I think so. And I think it's hard because in a way that using terms white, black, brown aren't controversial nowadays amongst many people, if I was to say that I'm yellow, or if I looked at someone and I went, oh, he's yellow, people would, I think, really be bothered by it.
Yes.
And it seems like in this conversation about race, because maybe East Asians have been perceived as being successful for a minority, it means that actually there's a level at which there's an exclusion. When sort of other ethnic minorities are talking about race, they're talking about being black, being brown, or talking about people being white. The yellow people are left out of that question. Like, no one's looking at me thinking I'm any of those other things.
Yeah.
So why do I not get a label in the game? It's hard though, because on the flip side, it in a way does feel offensive. I think there's that quote at the start of the book where Daisy's talking to her daughter, and her daughter goes, I think she's writing a poem or something, and her daughter looks at it and goes, oh, I'm not yellow though, I'm peach. Because like no one is yellow coloured. I think Daisy also makes an effort to she suggests at least that gold might be a nice way of talking about it. Or at least I think talks about that in terms of the golden era of reclaiming what it means to be East Asian Chinese. And I think that is empowering in a certain way. And I don't think there's necessarily one right answer to this, but perhaps the thing that we should learn from it is to reflect on kind of being conscious of trying to find a place and trying to work with others to really fight for a sort of racial equality in a way that, in these really subtle ways that maybe aren't yet on the main stage.
And finally, I just think there's one quite central question that Daisy asks right at the start of the book, which is, one of the key concerns at the heart of this book is to look at who counts as British Chinese, or as some prefer, Chinese Brits. Do you have to be a UK citizen? What if you're from a Commonwealth country? Is it enough that you're simply living in Britain, or do you need to have permanent residency? Can you be a recent immigrant? Is there a notable transition from Chinese in Britain to British Chinese? What about people with mixed heritage? Are we talking about racial identity, ethnicity, nationality, or all of the above? And the simple answer to those questions is, it's complicated.
And in a certain way, I don't think it matters. It's not aimed at anyone, right? No. It's not to say that having a conversation about being British Chinese means that you have to resonate with that identity. But what we should take away from having this conversation with ourselves and with Daisy is to have empathy and openness, and to really sort of look at our history in a way that we haven't before, and just to learn and to be more informed, so that when you go out into the world, you really have a better sense of who you are. I think when I was reading this, some parts of it spoke to me, some parts didn't. And that's okay, because it's not about having one narrative. She talks to a multitude of people, all who come from different backgrounds.
Yeah, and she talks to people who say, I've never actually felt British. I've never felt this is my country. Having said that, I've never felt I have a country because I know I'm not really Chinese. How could I be if I don't speak Chinese? For a long, long time, this was a big problem for me, not belonging anywhere, until I started meeting other people like me. And then she talked to, I think she talked to people who are second generation Chinese and who have websites that they use to group together and talk to other people. And that's really nice because they have a community. And find your own community, find a community, build a community, make the step, find people like you. But then, and it's okay not to be like anyone else, because Daisy then talks to people who says, well, even herself, like Alvin, I've felt a similar impulse to explain my origins and my lack of connection to China, both to educate others about the heterogeneity of Chinese diaspora and preserve my individuality against the violence of generalization. And it's really important to know that we're all different. Yes, we are one cohort and you can generalize us, but actually we're a group of individuals and every single one of us different. I'm very different from you. Yeah, we're related, but still we're significantly different.
And I think the point of the book isn't necessarily to present an identity of being British Chinese as much as it is providing a space to be able to talk about our experiences. She's not saying that, the histories that she's written about are the only ones that are there, but maybe they're the starting step for me to think and for me to be able to access at least part of what it means to be British Chinese.
And she goes into a story where she interviews someone else and says no one really cared what kind of Chinese people they were. There were 4 of them studying music at school, and they were called 4 Cindy's, Cindy 1, Cindy 2, Cindy 3, Cindy 4, because no one cared. They were just put into a indistinguishable mass, or they were ignored.
And I don't think this is true of just, Chinese communities or East Asian communities, but we really want to put people into boxes. And the way to overcome, I think, all the strife that is happening, all the tension that exists, is to realize that you and I are as different as everyone else. Like, I don't need a box. I don't need to be a certain thing or seen as part of a certain body to be valuable and important as an individual.
Towards the end, she says she's officially British, with the passport to prove it. But her feelings of being British are complex and ever-changing. The longer she's here, perhaps the more British she will feel. But the lines to construct citizenship and notions of community simultaneously include and exclude, and we should wield that power very carefully.
I think opening the book, I was a bit sort of skeptical because I was like, so what does someone who's born in Canada, who's Asian, who's Chinese, but actually from a different part of China than where our family is from, who lived in America and only moved to the UK about 10 years ago, what does she have to say to me, who's lived here all her life, as someone who really identifies as British Chinese? Why do I need to be having this conversation with someone who doesn't seem to have as much of a say? And then reading the book, you realize it's not about that. It's not about qualifying, having the qualifications to be British Chinese. It's about telling ourselves, educating ourselves on our history, on the deep complexities that I'm sure exist outside of the bounds of the book. The point isn't to try and unify in a closed box of one identity, but to share the multitude of experiences and appreciate that and go into the world acknowledging that you should have empathy for everyone, no matter who they identify as.
And I think Daisy finishes the book on a very positive note about hope. But we won't read out to spoil the story there. Any final closing thoughts, Eli?
I guess I just want to say thanks for listening. It was really nice to be back. I'm glad that I could talk about this book and have this conversation and share a little bit more about my experiences being British Chinese. I think that's...
Do you know what the flower is on the cover of the book?
No idea.
So in one section of the book, Daisy talks about the remembrance poppy, the red poppy, and its connection to the Opium Wars, but the red poppy nonetheless. And she mentions the second flower, which is the forget-me-not. And so I think it's forget-me-not. And I guess the overarching story here to take away is don't forget about us, and don't forget about yourself. So
don't forget about community.
Yeah.
And love and hope.
Yeah.